This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio.
I'm Abby Llorico, in for Elaine Cha. The St. Louis Convention and Visitors Commission is the organization that markets this metropolitan area as a place for conventions and tourism. It's more commonly known as Explore St. Louis. Earlier this month, Brad Dean started as new president and CEO of Explore St. Louis. That comes after his predecessor, Kitty Ratcliffe, who served in the role for nearly 20 years, agreed to retire early. She had received criticism over delays and costs of expanding the downtown convention center. The agreement to retire several months early came in exchange for a golden parachute that netted her a year's salary, a bonus, health insurance for a year, and a car. In total, about $500,000. A bit later in the show, I'll talk with STLPR economic development reporter Eric Schmid. But first, let's hear my conversation with Explore St. Louis's Brad Dean. I first asked him about what he knew about St. Louis before taking this top job.
Ironically, the first vacation I remember as a child, about 6, 7 years old, was coming to St. Louis. And, when you grow up in a farming community in central Illinois, the biggest arches I'd ever seen were the golden arches above McDonald's. So to come here, stand behind the arch, explore Forest Park, where it just felt like the end of the earth had to be somewhere in there. And the mystique, the magic, the special nature and vibe of this city kind of changed my life as a child, because it was the first time where I realized there was something more than cornfields. And 4 decades later, to come back and now be charged with the opportunity to promote and sell this iconic city, it's a really special moment for me. So I saw it as a child. I've watched it as an industry professional, but now I'm all in on St. Louis and delighted to be the newest resident of St. Louis.
With that nostalgia, but then also the professional perspective you're bringing here, how would you describe the state of St. Louis tourism right now? Yeah,
St. Louis tourism is certainly faced some challenges, but we're in a good space in that we're growing. We're seeing some substantial growth over the past 12 to 18 months. And while we're not quite back to pre-pandemic levels, this could be the year where we get there. And I think the future is bright, Abby. When you think about just the numbers alone, the last full year of travel and tourism, almost 24 million people visited the St. Louis region and generated $5.7 billion of economic impact. Big numbers. Let's put those into perspective. On an average day, not July 4th, not opening day for the Cardinals, just a day like today, an average day will welcome will bring in about $16 million of economic impact and $3 million of taxes to local governments and sustain 87,000 jobs. So if you want to understand the impact and status of travel and tourism today, think of what St. Louis would be without $16 million today in our economy, without $3 million in government tax revenues, and 87,000 people in the unemployment lines. And I think that tells you the importance and why St. Louis's travel and tourism industry is one of its top industries. That said, we have a lot of growing and a lot of opportunity, and I didn't come here to maintain the status quo. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to deliver record numbers and unprecedented job growth in the near future.
You think that we're close to pre-pandemic levels? What makes you say that?
Well, in part because of the visitation we've already seen so far this year. I mean, just within the last couple of weeks, there have been some big groups in the downtown area. And we know that the spring season is certainly looking promising from the advanced bookings. But booking happens so quickly and with such a short lead time in today's environment that we don't plan travel quite as much in advance as we used to. You have to keep your finger on the pulse of that. So just based on the numbers we see today and the most recent forecasts from outside researchers, it looks like we'll be at or maybe slightly above pre-pandemic levels by the time we get to the end of this year. Now, let's be honest. A lot of communities were already way above pre-pandemic levels. In fact, where I came from, my last destination, we led the U.S. in post-pandemic growth, and we were way above pre-pandemic levels a couple years ago. So we've got some catching up to do. But if I look at what's happening and the booking pace, and most importantly, the investment that's coming into the market and some of the exciting things that are already underway, we're well positioned for not just a comeback. This is a takeover. We're going to launch St. Louis travel and tourism to new heights.
Explore St. Louis often markets and connects with large-scale events, conventions, and whatnot. How booked out are we for those kind of headline marquee events for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, we've had, so far, I think for 2025, we're booked over 245 groups. Now, for every one of those groups that's in the Americas Center, about 4 of those are in outlying hotels. So we've had some big groups. Trans World was in a couple weeks ago. We've had this huge Capital Sports sporting event, which brings families to St. Louis multiple weekends throughout the year. Later on this month, we have a huge manufacturing association conference, which will bring upwards of 10,000 people to downtown. And of course, one of the keys for us at Explore St. Louis, and I think one of our strategies going forward, is you want to bring them to the Americas Center, but the real special part of the visit is when you get them out into the neighborhoods and some of the outlying attractions. And so based on the bookings right now, we're seeing some positive trends, and we have to continue to sell and promote the destination as it emerges and evolves as a real iconic, epic meetings and events destination. At the same time, enhancing the brand so we bring new visitors into St. Louis. So we're not where we want to be, but we're certainly moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of trends, crime is down in St. Louis. That tracks with national trends as well. Yet crime and the perception of crime in St. Louis is still a really big deal here. The old saying goes that perception is often reality, right? Just earlier this year, we had a local chef close down her restaurant downtown on Pine Street, and she says it was in part due to safety concerns. Burglaries, theft, homeless people harassing customers. Not always violent crime, but the kind of crimes that make people feel unsafe. What do you make of concerns like this?
Well, I think you touched on the key point that we have to keep in mind. It's really 2 issues. There's the issue of public safety, and then there's a perception surrounding that. First and foremost, we can't put our heads in the sand and ignore the problem. We have to be vigilant about what we do in terms of ensuring that every neighborhood, and particularly the downtown, are safe and welcoming and clean. And that also goes a long way towards building the brand of St. Louis. And so we've got to work closely with our law enforcement community. I've been very encouraged by the meetings that I've had so far. I've only been here for just a few days, but we've got some really talented people in law enforcement and ongoing investments in public safety that I think are helping to ensure that those numbers will continue to grow down. Part of our role is to make sure we're talking about this honestly, accurately, and doing what we can to support those in law enforcement and public services that are making it a safer community. At the same time, we have to be cognizant about what we say that extends outward. And it's interesting because when I was doing my research about St. Louis, the most negative things I heard about our community came from residents of the community. Now, not necessarily out of animosity or hatred. I think it's just a sense of maybe frustration and disappointment of what could be versus what is. And so I think what we got to do is balance this and address the real problems, not ignore them. At the same time, we have to also be cognizant and recognize that the issues we're facing are not unique to St. Louis. And if you look at the numbers, we're certainly not an unsafe community. And that's not the way our visitors think. But we have to talk about ourselves in perhaps a more positive light of not just what's happened in the past, but what's taking place today, and encourage people to know that when you come here, we value your safety, but then we got to deliver on that promise.
Yeah, because going back to the numbers aren't necessarily the problem. It is that, again, perception. You talk about being vigilant, getting that messaging out there. But if you're talking to someone who wants to bring a convention downtown, wants to bring young people downtown, but they're concerned about safety because of things that have happened to people who are visiting St. Louis, or to just, again, reference that long-time perception, how do you respond to them, not just with numbers, but with how do you speak to their emotions?
Yeah, the numbers will never win the day. I mean, we can look at the numbers. We should and pay attention to those because that tells a story. But I think a couple things have to happen. And this is where Explore St. Louis plays such a vital role. Part of public safety is vibrancy. You know, you think about Times Square. There are a lot of crimes in and around that area, but it's not an area you don't feel safe in part because there's so many people and so much activity. So the more vibrancy we create in downtown, the more safer it will feel. So how do you do that? Well, first, we got to work closely with the businesses and particularly some of the investors that are bringing capital downtown. Secondly, we have to create and enhance events that will attract people. So part of what we do at Explore St. Louis is bringing meetings and conventions conventions, but we also balance that with consumer-facing events that are important for residents of St. Louis. We have to get to the point where we all recognize and feel like this is our downtown. And one of the things my experience has taught me in other communities is if you have a healthy, vibrant downtown, it benefits everybody in the city and the county. So part of it is just action. Part of it's being honest and transparent about what is and isn't working. And then part of it's also just recognizing how we talk about our community. We cannot affirm the outside narrative that is entirely unfair to our community. And we don't want to talk about ourselves the way people in Chicago and Indianapolis wish we were talking about ourselves. We have to be more competitive with that. But you don't do that by misleading or misguiding ourselves. We have to be honest and transparent about what's working, fix the problems that aren't, and then talk about ourselves in a more positive, uplifting way, which is really just sharing the story of St. Louis and what it really is and what it offers.
Sounds like you're speaking to something about pride, not just the people who choose to live in city limits, but the people who live around St. Louis having a sense of pride and ownership over what happens in our economic and tourism hub in the city.
Absolutely. And let's face it, what happens downtown affects everybody in the city and the county. And I think one of the beauties of Explore St. Louis is that we get to promote the city, the county, the whole region, and that means working with our partners here. And one of the great things about this job is I come into some existing partnerships like St. Louis Sports Commission, Greater St. Louis, Inc., the Gateway Arts Foundation, just to name a few, who are doing some exceptional work pushing that boulder up the hill. So part of this goes back to creating vibrancy by collaborative partnerships and making sure that we're all aligned. There's many paths up that mountaintop, but the view is the same once we get there. And so if we're working together with a common shared vision, building the brand as inclusive and aspirational, then public safety becomes a strength and not an impediment. And that gives all of us, whether you live in the city, the county, or outlying areas, something proud to claim and say, I'm from St. Louis. Hey, I get the privilege of not only promoting this place, one of my greatest honors and privileges is I'm now a resident of St. Louis. And so for me, it's a great privilege to be here. There's a sense of community pride. We just need to lift that up and celebrate that in the right way.
I'm talking with Brad Dean, the new president and CEO of Explore St. Louis. He started in this role just this month. Brad, you just mentioned some of those organizations here. We're talking about the St. Louis Regional Convention and Sports Authority. Greater St. Louis, Inc. is another one of those organizations. How would you explain how Explore St. Louis is different from those organizations and how you all work together?
Yeah, we're different in that, first and foremost, we manage 3 cherished assets. Number one, the Dome, which of course has had its challenges, but a historic facility that still serves a purpose of economic vitality today. There are events and activities in the Dome, not as many as we hoped in the future, but it's an important part of what we do. Secondly, we manage and promote and sell the Americas Center, one of the largest and most versatile convention centers in the country. And then, Abby, we play a really critical role, not independently and not exclusively, but we're an important part of really managing and nurturing the brand of St. Louis. That's the image and reputation. Along with that comes great accountability. When the public not only invests public funds, but public trust in building a brand and of course, in our role, managing and cherishing and nurturing that, that's incredibly important. And that's a unique role created by statute, but also by tradition and history. This is one of the older destination marketing organizations in the country, around for more than a century. So that's how we differentiate ourselves. We're selling and promoting not just meetings and conventions, but giving people a reason to come here for a great vacation, a getaway, or just lose yourself by finding yourself in neighborhoods and experiences that you wouldn't find otherwise. However, when you think about the role of downtown, about job creation, about economic development, that's where we share a collaborative opportunity and a responsibility. You think about tourism, it's not just an industry that fills hotels and restaurants. It's often a first date for economic development and commercial investment. Nobody ever moves a business to a community without staying in a hotel, eating in a restaurant, talking to taxi drivers and Uber drivers. And so if we do our jobs well, it makes Greater St. Louis better at what they do. And of course, what they're doing is bringing business and investment and visitors to town. We have an extraordinary sports commission here. In fact, I was thrilled when I was interviewing for this job because in my previous 2 jobs, I had to create a sports commission and manage it. Here, you have an all-star team managing that. So part of our role is to collaborate well with the partners who are in the similar space or working towards similar goals. At the same time, we have to be absolutely exceptional at promoting and selling St. Louis as a great meetings and events destination and a great place for vacations and getaways.
You mentioned the convention center has seen its better days, perhaps. Mounting costs for construction and upgrades at the convention center led to a lot of criticism for your predecessor in this role, Kitty Radcliffe. She was handed some significant incentives to retire from the role early. Now that you're in this position, what is your vision for the convention center moving forward?
Clearly, there have been some challenges. I think most of those are behind us. We're in the very final phase of the current expansion. And when it's ended, we're going to end up with a larger, more versatile convention center than we had before. Some unique amenities, for example, the culinary garden, which, by the way, is not a garden. It's a small farm in downtown St. Louis, which I think serves a couple of really unique advantages. First and foremost, we will now be able to grow over a period of time tons of food that will be used in meals right in St. Louis. Think about that. Farm-produced meals in St. Louis that never touch a truck. So from a sustainable travel and meeting standpoint, that's a real competitive advantage. It also, I think, is symbolic because we are in the heartland of America where we produce food for billions of people. We're also a bit of a foodie town. I don't think St. Louis gets nearly as much credit as it deserves as a foodie town with some extraordinary chefs and James Beard-nominated culinary artists. This is a great way to amplify that message that this is a great place not only to visit, but to enjoy great gastronomy. And so those types of advantages give us I think, a better, brighter future at the convention center. We have to manage the monies accordingly. We have to be accountable for the results. And while it hasn't been an easy journey to get here, I think the end product is going to be a better, more versatile convention center with some unique amenities. What we have to do at Explore St. Louis is fine-tune our sales and marketing strategy and recognize what we can do and what we can't do. And as you know, and all of your listeners are aware, the expansion didn't end up where we wanted. But it's like the Rolling Stones sang. Can't always get what you want, but sometimes you get what you need. And what we've got today is a better, more versatile convention center. So my role is to make sure that we align the strategies, manage the resources responsibly with a high degree of accountability and integrity, and make sure we are tenacious in selling this. If St. Louis is going to be successful in the future, we have to sell this destination with a bit of a chip on our shoulder, kind of like the Blues skate out onto the ice. Now, we're not starting any fights on the sales floor, but I'm telling you, when it comes to Chicago, Indianapolis, Nashville, Memphis, we're coming after them. We're going to take some business from them because I believe we have the best premier destination in the Midwest. We're an epic city, and we are writing an amazing chapter in our future. Now we just have to align our sales, marketing strategies to amplify the great message that we have an even better convention center. So maybe it was tough getting here, but I think we're in a good place, and I'm optimistic about what lies ahead.
That's Brad Dean, the new president and CEO of Explore St. Louis, the organization responsible for promoting the area for conventions and tourism. We'll have more of my conversation after this short break. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. I'm Abby Llorico. Let's get back to my conversation now with Brad Dean, the new president and CEO of Explore St. Louis, the organization responsible for promoting the area for conventions and tourism. Explore St. Louis poured a lot of resources into this search, into finding its next leader. What do you think makes you right for this role?
Well, first, I've come from a couple of communities that were anchored on beaches. So right off the bat, you think Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Puerto Rico, what does that have to do with St. Louis? But what people might be surprised to find out is that those destinations had some similar challenges. One of the keys to growing tourism in those communities, and we doubled tourism in Myrtle Beach during my time there, Puerto Rico went from a perennial underperformer to leading the nation over the past 3 years and number 2 in the world. The way we did that was, number one, revitalizing downtown. So, shocker, not the only community in the world that has a tough downtown situation. We faced that in both of my previous communities, and we were able to do that by collaboration and innovative thinking. Secondly, both of those communities excelled at finding meetings and conventions and sporting events that were perfectly suited for those communities. Now, what worked in Myrtle Beach, of course, wouldn't work in St. Louis and vice versa, but using sports and entertainment as a way to lift the brand. The other thing that we did, especially in Puerto Rico, was finding the unique attributes and the experiences that were under-recognized and the amenities that were perhaps under-discovered, if you will, and leaned into that. And I think that's going to be a key strategy for us, Abby, because there are some anchor brands and attractions here that will always be a core part of the visitor base. You think about the Arch, Anheuser-Busch, you think about Forest Park and some of the other historical attractions and experiences that everybody knows about. We're still going to promote and sell those. But I think what's going to define us going forward, and what I've done in my past to grow travel and tourism, is to define those unique experiences. And I think we're in an interesting space right now, because if you look at the trends of travel, particularly the younger generation, those in their 20s and 30s, they're way beyond the top 10 list, the bucket list, the Instagrammable locations. What they're looking for, and what I think we can actually not just compete in, but lead the nation in, is an era of urban exploration. Travelers who want the amenities and the comforts of being in a metropolitan market, but still want to get out and do their own curated experiences. And what that means is not just where you go, but who you meet. The younger traveler's more in tune to not just seeing the art, but meeting the artist, not just experiencing the food, but knowing the chef. So as we get to tell those stories, one business, one experience, one entrepreneur at a time, I think we can actually elevate St. Louis's brand. And that's much what we did in Puerto Rico, was recognizing what was unique and differentiated there. And hey, let's face it, Puerto Rico telling the world it has beaches is like St. Louis saying we've got the Arch. Tell me something I don't know is what the travelers want. And as we get better and better at that, I think not only will we give people more reasons to come, we're going to expose ourselves to audiences that aren't necessarily thinking about St. Louis today, but the research tells us we have what they want.
That's interesting that you say that, because I think that more often than not, when we talk about tourism and the destinations people are seeking out, it's because you see it on social media, or because it is Instagrammable, or it is something that they've been kind of told is a good destination. You see that national parks and historic locations are being overrun by tourism, and people are saying it's ruined. So what makes you say that it's different? I'm curious about that analysis, that's not going to be the case for future travel.
Yeah, and it's not to say that people won't visit those attractions. They're always going to line up around the Arch. They're always going to go see a Cardinals game. Those things aren't going to change. But travelers today are looking for unique experiences, something that they couldn't experience elsewhere. But they want to share it. They want to show it. And what really differentiates a destination today is aligning with what you can do here that you wouldn't be able to do elsewhere. Now, here's the beauty of St. Louis. There is so much here. In fact, it's kind of hard to define the brand when you think about the diversity and array of attractions and experiences. We have some amazing entrepreneurial vibe in this community. So being able to lift that up actually helps us differentiate it. And here's why that works today, Abby, more so maybe than ever before. 20 years ago, you just had to know your customer like you knew your neighbors, right? And you look for big mass movement. Today, with social media, and particularly with artificial intelligence, we've reached a level in marketing what we think of as hyper-segmentation. We almost have to know the customer like we know our best friend or our spouse or our partner. And that allows us to differentiate the messaging in ways that we couldn't before. That also allows us to connect with consumers on different levels. So as we approach more of an aspirational brand as opposed to a traditional brand, it will open us up to new travelers and new reasons for travel. So the research tells us that this is an opportunity. You just have to find the right niche. And I think for us, urban exploration is a great opportunity. The research tells me that. In listening to local businesses, I think they're already traveling down this path. So at Explore, we just need to make sure that we're facilitating that. Of course, all of this assumes we have the right digital tools to amplify that message. And so one of the first things we have to do is look at what we're doing today and how we're doing it, where we're investing our money and where we're not, and make certain that we bring a high degree of accountability. At the end of the day, these are public funds, and we're representing the people of the St. Louis region, so we have to operate with the highest levels of efficiency and accountability. But I wouldn't say we're behind the times, but there's certainly opportunities for us to catch up and advance ourselves beyond the competition simply by recognizing what the traveler wants today and how do we meet those needs.
So you mentioned this, that your most recent role was CEO of Discover Puerto Rico. You also worked for 20 years as president and CEO of the Myrtle Beach Area Convention and Visitors Bureau. Since you've been in St. Louis, you've seen our weather is very different. So Any chance, like, you're going to bring some tropical vibes? I mean, are we going to see a beach on the Mississippi Riverfront? How do you market the geographic location that is this chaotic, beautiful Midwest climate?
Yeah, I got a little bit of experience with that already because the week I was here doing my final interview for the job was the week of the big snowstorm. And,
which one this year?
This was the first one, I guess, in early January. And I grew up in the Midwest, so I was kind of used to this, although I've been out of this weather for a long time. But my wife is a native Caribbeaner, so she's lived in the islands forever. She thinks it's cruel and unusual punishment to have to deal with snow and ice. And so when she saw this, I explained to her, this is the 100-year storm. We'll never see this again. I'm sticking to that story, Abby, at least for the spring and the summer. Here's what I think we can do is, while the weather may not be our strong suit, keep in mind the number of indoor attractions and experiences and the great gastronomy. And I think what we can present is a healthy brand and alternatives that you can enjoy St. Louis regardless of the weather outdoors. So I can't rely on beaches and sunshine here, but what we have is the culture, the history, the architecture, not to mention some great music, entertainment, and sports, and that's our strength. And so this is a city where you can smile and have fun, whether it's raining, snowing, or sunny.
You mentioned earlier that the tourism industry involves a lot of those kind of first date situations. And you quite literally had that with your wife here in St. Louis. So where did you take her in the middle of a snowstorm in St. Louis to convince her that this is the place to be?
Well, she's an art lover. So selling her on we're moving to a community with Van Goghs and the Art Museum was a big draw. The number of free attractions, of course, we couldn't see the zoo, but just looking at what that offers. And I think the other thing that my wife picked up, and this was really her first time in St. Louis as a visitor, was not only some great restaurants, but there's some unique vibe here. We think of some of the lounges and the cafes, and plus the live music. We were also very fortunate that we happened to be here one night where the Blues Museum had an open mic night. And we were both blown away at the extraordinary talent. I mean, there are some musicians that you may not know their name, but you love their music. And just seeing that kind of talent emerge, I think told both of us, this is not only going to be a great place to promote, this is going to be a great community to live. And for me and my family, that was part of the decision. I've lived in some beautiful communities, but it is a real honor and a privilege to be able to be the newest resident of St. Louis. And just imagine getting paid to tell the St. Louis story. I mean, this is a dream come true.
Brad Dean, the new president and CEO of Explore St. Louis, came here from one of the places where you have to fly, coming from Puerto Rico. St. Louis is quite drivable from most places in the country, but you quite literally had to fly in. The St. Louis Lambert International Airport is undergoing plans for a terminal redesign, the first phase of which should be open within the next 3 years. The airport is the first entry point for so many visitors. First off, what did you think about our airport?
I love the airport for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the connectivity. Secondly, it does a good job. The airport and the team there, particularly the leadership, recognize the importance of setting the tone for the experience. A lot of airports, you just run through them. And if you can just find baggage claim, you're happy. Here, you really can't travel through Lambert without seeing some great photography and video and imagery of what to expect. The fact that we have really a world-class art installation right in the airport sends a very powerful message that you've just arrived in a community that appreciates the arts. And a community that appreciates the arts generally is a community that's very welcoming. So my first impression is it's clean, it's safe, it's efficient, but it's got just enough branded identity that it sets us apart from other airports. Our job is to keep them busy and then work with the airport on the expansion to make sure that it's built and serviced for the future. So I'm considering our Lambert International Airport as a competitive advantage, especially when I think about some of the airports I traveled through during my normal course of business, and I'll take Lambert over most of the competition any day.
Really? I think that's outside perspective that some St. Louisans could use with this airport renovations, these coming here. I've experienced picking someone up from the airport and then driving them downtown. The drive from the airport to downtown St. Louis doesn't exactly give the best impression. There's decay, there's graffiti. It doesn't give the sense of a vibrant city. What are the kind of things that you are hoping to enhance or you think could be enhanced in that first impression sequence of someone arriving in St. Louis, walking through the airport, and then getting to their hotel, for example, downtown?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge, but I think it's also one of our greatest opportunities. As you think about that journey from the airport to downtown or wherever you might be going, there are pockets of excellence. There are some developments and businesses and entrepreneurs that are doing some really great things. And when you think of the tech base here and some of the industries that have come in, St. Louis is well positioned for a bright economic future, even regardless of travel and tourism. But to your point, Abby, around those pockets of excellence are some mounds of mediocrity in areas that we have to address, both the visible aesthetics and beauty, but also making sure that the economic flow is connected. And I think that's one of the things we can do as we look to address, are we serving the industry the right way? Would we be better able to serve with maybe a different model of how we deliver services?
People became quite familiar with Explore St. Louis in its previous iterations and, frankly, under its previous leader, Kitty Ratcliffe. What would you say will be different about your leadership? What are some concrete ways in which you are looking to explore different models?
Well, first and foremost, the last thing St. Louis needs is a know-it-all leader to come from the outside saying, I got all the answers. So I'm doing what my grandfather taught me to do as a young boy. You get 2 ears and 1 mouth, and there's a reason. So I'm doing a lot of listening. In fact, even before I started, I'd had over 200 conversations with leaders, investors, customers, and clients. Some clients coming here, some customers and clients going to our competition, just to understand really 3 things. What's working in St. Louis, what's not working, and most importantly, what's possible here. It's interesting, that last question really energizes people, because when you ask somebody from St. Louis what's possible, it's limitless. And that excites me and energizes me and others. So the first thing I'm doing is listening. Now, of course, I didn't get hired to just do a listening tour. So a few things that I'm going to really emphasize early on is, as I mentioned earlier, we have to be accountable. We're receiving public funds. We're managing publicly owned assets. The residents of the St. Louis region should expect nothing less than integrity and accountability, not only in what we do, but how we do it and how we report it. Second thing, we have to be modernizing everything we do. So, for example, we tend to be maybe a paper-driven organization. Some of the things we do have worked very well in the past, but in our industry today, so much has changed in the last decade. In fact, just since the pandemic, that if you're not getting better, by default, you're getting worse. So we have to do a much better job at seizing on trends. Now, here's the good news. This is such a entrepreneurial community with so many tech entrepreneurs. We don't have to create trends. We don't have to create technology. We just have to embrace what's out there. So we're going to look to modernize our processes and strategies. And I think, going back to your question, it's an interesting discussion to consider today. We have a membership model, so it's a kind of pay-to-play deal. That's very traditional. Would we be better served by finding a better way to bring everybody in? One of the things I learned in Puerto Rico is when you create a big inclusive table where everybody in the visitor economy has a seat, it's more challenging and more complex to manage, kind of like a big Thanksgiving dinner. But it's a lot more fun and a lot more productive because you can get everybody aligned in the same direction. Does that model work with our financial model, and does that fit this community? I think it's a little premature for me to come in and say that, but here's what I do know. I wasn't hired to manage the status quo, and I have yet to have anybody in St. Louis say, Brad, just keep us between the lines. Just keep doing what we're doing well. I think everybody's hungry. There's an appetite for change and innovation here. So I'm going to be looking at what's working and what could work better. Not only what we're doing, but what aren't we doing? And what I really want to focus on is enhancing the competitiveness of our region and our organization by modernizing, by collaborating, and making certain that we do our fair share of work to contribute to elevating the brand of St. Louis. If we do that, then we can ensure that the best days of St. Louis lie before us and not behind us.
We need to take a quick break now, but we'll be back shortly to continue my conversation with Brad Dean, the new president and CEO of Explore St. Louis. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. I'm Abby Llorico, in for Elaine Cha. In just a moment, I'll talk with STLPR economic development reporter Eric Schmid about his reaction to my conversation with new Explore St. Louis president and CEO Brad Dean. But for now, let's hear the final few minutes of my conversation with Dean. We continued by addressing the St. Louis region's long history of racial tensions. You'd be hard-pressed to find a city in the United States that is experiencing positive growth, whether it's residential or tourism, where the Black population isn't also thriving or at least being served. Here in St. Louis, the NAACP maintains a travel advisory for the state of Missouri advising extreme caution for Black people. To read it, it says, quote, individuals traveling in the state are advised to travel with extreme caution. Race, gender, and color-based crimes have a long history in Missouri. Missouri, home of Lloyd Gaines, Dred Scott, and the dubious distinction of the Missouri Compromise, is one of the last states to lose its slaveholding past, may not be safe. What is your response to this travel advisory and particularly your message to Black visitors and Black people who live here?
You know, in my prior roles in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina is a state that was not always friendly to people that didn't look like me. In fact, I was one of the first business leaders that spoke out on the need of bringing the Confederate battle flag down from the State House grounds. Now, for some people in that state, that was their family's history and heritage. For others in that state, my neighbors, my friends, my coworkers, it was a sign of hatred and racism. And that wasn't an easy battle. But what I learned from that is the first thing you have to do, you can't ignore it. We have to put those issues on the table. And we have to talk, and not just talk at each other. We have to talk to each other, and that means listen and learn and not ignore those problems. So the first thing is we have to bring to this a willingness to listen, learn from each other. And I think from a travel and tourism perspective, Abby, it's important to amplify and build towards an inclusive brand that welcomes people from all walks of life. The second thing is I will tell you, and I think this is actually where my experience in Puerto Rico serves me well, because it's the first time in my career where I've been the minority. First time in my career where I've been treated differently because of the color of my skin, because I was where I was from and how I spoke. Not always badly, just differently. And I will tell you, as much as I've been a champion of inclusivity in terms of leadership and development, it changed my perspective because it gave me a much different view of the world when you've seen it from there. So I think I'm certainly ready and prepared to entertain those discussions. Specifically, I think we have to strive for a community where people feel safe and welcomed. And that's not just a public safety discussion. So whether it's the NAACP or other organizations, and whether it's African Americans or Hispanics, whether in our country, from outside our country, whatever it is, we've got to strive to be a community that feels welcoming. But we don't just say that in the marketing, we deliver that. I will say, and I look at the staff of Explore St. Louis as a great example, it's a very diverse staff, diverse in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, and race, and they work together really well. And you know the one common theme I've noticed with them? They are passionate about St. Louis. Most of them are lifelong residents, a few are transplants. Some live in the eastern metro area and drive across the river, but they are passionate and united behind St. Louis. I don't think they're the exception. I think that's the norm. But we don't reach the optimal point by ignoring those problems or discounting them. I think we have to have open, honest discourse followed by action. And that begins by listening and learning from each other.
In a year, how will we be able to measure whether or not Brad Dean has had a successful first year leading Explore St. Louis?
A year from now, we will be known as an organization that excels in collaboration, that's easy to work with and fun to do business with. Secondly, we'll be able to talk about the progress we've made in not just expanding the Americas Center, but growing the business that comes to and through the Americas Center. Third, I hope, Abby, a year from now, we're talking about finally we're beyond pre-pandemic levels of travel and tourism, but more importantly, looking towards a future with verified, credible projections from economists that say we're well positioned to grow above the national average. And finally, and perhaps long-term, maybe most importantly, I hope we're having some earnest, honest discussions about the brand of St. Louis. And that's not just Explore St. Louis's responsibility, but we obviously have a role in that. I think for us to achieve the potential to be everything this region can be and what we want it to be, we have to aspire to an inclusive, aspirational brand that appeals to travelers that aren't currently thinking about us. We play a role in that, but we don't do that alone. And so I hope while we're talking about economic results, and we have to be accountable for those, I hope we're also having some earnest discussions about the brand of St. Louis. And that means addressing all of the challenges you've mentioned and others, but also celebrating what makes this community really special. This is an iconic region within the United States, not without some challenges, but I believe, and the reason why I came here is I believe our opportunities dwarf our challenges. If my career were a trip to the casino, I pushed all my chips to the center of the table, all in on St. Louis, because I think this is a winning hand.
Anything you're most excited about on a personal level? Events, cultural institutions, anything that you're most looking forward to immersing yourself in the next year?
Well, as a sports fan, I couldn't be more excited to be in a sports city, and opening day for the Cardinals is looming not too far ahead, and I've never attended an opening day, so excited about that. I'm also really fascinated by what Carolyn Kendall and the team have done at Energizer Park. And of course, St. Louis has a soccer legacy like none other, but that facility and the marketing around it has really lifted the brand. It's creating a lot of energy and buzz outside of St. Louis. Beyond that, getting to explore some of the neighborhoods and attractions that I've heard about but haven't quite seen yet. I've sampled Emo's Pizza. I've got Ted Drew's down, so I've done the initial checkoffs, but there's a lot more to experience here on the culinary side. So getting in and around the neighborhoods, experiencing some of the unique businesses and attractions, and I'm hoping by the end of my first year, I will check off every free museum in the area. That's a lot to check off, but I'm hoping I'll be able to get to those soon too.
Emo's Pizza, yay or nay?
Absolutely, all about Emo's Pizza.
With Provel?
I think you got to lean Provo, but definitely Emo's over deep dish.
That's Brad Dean, the new president and CEO of Explore St. Louis, the organization responsible for marketing the area as a destination for conventions and tourism. Dean started in that role earlier this month. Joining me now is St. Louis Public Radio economic development reporter Eric Schmid, who's been listening in on that conversation. Thanks for being here, Eric.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So, Eric, I know in your beat here at STLPR, you pay a lot of attention to those topics that Brad and I were just discussing. Your main takeaways from that?
Yeah, I'm definitely impressed with what he has to say, and I really think it shows why Dean landed this job. He's very obviously well-trained and... but it says the right things and has a good understanding, or appears to have a really good understanding, of how St. Louis, Explore St. Louis, can fit into the local fabric, what it can do, and also where it should be leveraging its connections with different partners or different, other organizations in the community, and not trying to do too much or step outside of its lane.
Mm-hmm. Dean spoke to the idea of making St. Louis a better place to visit, and along with that, making it a better place to live and do business. So that sounds simple enough, but what, from your perspective, are some concrete ways in which that can really happen?
I think a lot of what I heard was the connection of, if you visit St. Louis, then you get a taste of St. Louis, and maybe that builds a momentum in terms of wanting to actually locate here, do business, and retain, move your company or move your individual life here, like he did. One of the things that actually really stuck out was when he was talking about the entrepreneurial spirit of the area, because that's something that I see a lot of. It is evident in Cortex. It's evident in some of the stuff happening downtown, also out in St. Louis County with the 39 North Ag Innovation District and stuff in there. I had a sense that he, when he was talking about updating the records or the management of Explore St. Louis from paper records to something else, I took that as, well, maybe we have the talent here to do that for us in a type of contracting type of way, versus we need to hire a new person, a new role to do that. It seemed to me like he wants to position the organization in a way to tap into what's already existing here and not reinvent the wheel.
And kind of shop around locally for that talent. If you're going to really put your money where your mouth is when it comes to saying this is a good place to do business, so then supporting the businesses that are already here too.
Yeah, and that's something that I've heard in talking to the tech entrepreneur, just the entrepreneurial like ecosystem here, is that we have the talent, we have the people who are already doing these things. Local governments, organizations, companies might need to contract out or set aside some money to establish contracts to solve those problems with existing talent.
Almost a year ago now, you and I sat down and talked about a Wall Street Journal article that painted St. Louis in a really bad light.
The infinite doom loop article.
Yeah, the infinite doom loop, the real estate nightmare unfolding in downtown St. Louis. I mean, beyond the headline, it really generated a lot of emotional responses locally. And in part, one of the responses was that this just focused on a couple of key blocks or buildings that have become hotspots for crime and vandalism, fallen into disrepair, and ignored a lot that was happening at the time. What, if anything, from what you've reported on and been watching, has changed since that article in April of 2024?
Yeah, I think that article really put up a mirror in front of St. Louis and said, this is what you are, to an outsider who came in and was able to experience one slice of what is here. And that reflection was ugly and people didn't like it, but I think it also reflected a lot of what was true or true to a specific experience. And since then, it kind of spurred the mayor to tell the St. Louis Development Corporation and Greater St. Louis Inc. to come up with a plan to deal with Millennium Hotel and Railway Exchange. Guess what? There's a major, $670 million proposal to replace the Millennium Hotel site with something new. The Railway Exchange building is moving through eminent domain. I mean, those are buildings that have been vacant for years, if not, I think both of them about a decade each for both of them. And now it's actually moving. There's also been some traction on Washington Ave. A lot of that you can attribute to Alex Oliver at Oliver Properties and some of the rehabilitations they're doing and gaining the site control of ground level retail and making something more cohesive. So there are things that are moving. It's still early on. If you go a couple blocks off Washington, it's still not very vibrant and filled in. There's still storefronts that are closed and whatnot.
Yeah, it might have stung a little bit, but to get clear eyes, we needed to do that, and then now we can look forward. You're mentioning some of these spots, though, the big anchor destinations, but what can be done to make these innovations, these improvement areas feel like more part of the fabric of the city and not just outliers that only serve a couple blocks here and there?
Yeah, I think if you take a walk through downtown, if you walk from Energizer Park or Union Station all the way to the Arch, there's not that much to do or to go see or to go inside of storefronts and whatnot in that walk. It's not, there's not a lot that would draw you in after the game. So it's you go to a game, maybe you go to Maggie O'Brien's, great. Yeah. But you go to Busch Stadium, you might go to Ballpark Village, but outside of that, what else is there to capture people's attention outside of those times? The essence of making a fabric, what I've heard a lot in reporting on this is creating that retail, that ground level activation of restaurants, of bars, of stores where you can shop and buy things, shirts, bags, mugs, whatever it is that people are, potentially selling. That's the thing that helps create that fabric and that vibrancy. And that takes time. It takes a lot of concerted effort to support those businesses and want them to survive after 6 months, a year, 2 years, because you can't just bring somebody in and be like, yay, we got a new business. And then if they close, then it's still not a net positive. So it's kind of needing to build that support in. And then also just, talking about our city in a better light, not talking down on it, because I think, St. Louisans love to rag on what is wrong and what isn't going so well. But I think what I took away from Brad Dean's conversation was that the more we start talking about, hey, these are all of the great things that are happening and that you can experience and that you can do. And yes, being realistic about the challenges, but not harping on them. Reframing that narrative can be really, really helpful.
And you help us do that by covering economic development for St. Louis Public Radio. Eric Schmid, thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
This episode was produced, recorded, and edited by Our executive producer, Alex Hoyer. Podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.